Now that you understand more about authentication and middleware, let's reevaluate this. At the moment, we're not fetching all of a user's projects, we're fetching all projects, period. And unless you're building a little web app for yourself, which is cool, but unless you're doing that, that's basically never what you want. Instead, you want to say, give me all the projects scoped to the current user. Let's go to Sublime. Here's the projects controller. And you can see, yep, project all is really good for tutorials, but in most cases, it's just not what you want. Imagine you were building Twitter. Would you ever do something like this? No. You'd never just fetch all the tweets. It would always be something like, give me the tweets for this given user, or scoped to this given user, or give me the feed for a given user. Well, you do it sometimes. I'd say it's fairly rare to do things like this. Okay, so instead, we would want to say, well, project, and you kind of want to say something like this, where the user ID or the owner ID is equal to the authenticated user's ID. Yeah, you could do something like that. So a couple things to review here. One, we are now adding a where conditional to our Eloquent query. This is sort of like saying select star from projects where the project's owner ID column is equal to whatever the currently authenticated user's ID is. Okay? Now, auth ID. So as it turns out, you have an auth helper function, or also an auth facade, if you prefer that. So you could do this as well. Anyways, I often do the helper function, since it does not require that you use the facade at the top. A little quicker. Anyhow, we can say auth ID, and this is going to give me null if the person is a guest, or their ID if they are currently signed in. However, I can also say auth user, and that's going to give me the user instance for whoever is currently signed in. And then also we have auth check, so this will return a Boolean. Check to see if the user is currently signed in. If I'm signed in, it returns true. If I'm a guest, it returns false. And then we also have some little helpers like auth guest. So you could say something like, well, if we have a guest user, then do the following. Okay, some helpers for you there. So in this case, if I want to just get the ID, I could use this syntax here. However, of course, at the moment, everything's going to blow up because we don't have an owner ID column. In fact, when we developed the table, we didn't even think about scoping it to users. So it sounds like we need to reevaluate. I'm searching for my create projects table migration that we built many lessons ago. At the moment, a project consists of a title and a description, but it sounds like it should also belong to a given user. So I will use not integer, but unsigned integer. And we'll call it, you can often keep it simple and do user ID, but it's sometimes confusing to me. So I want to know the owner ID for this project. And then we use unsigned here as a way to specify I'm expecting not just any integer, but a positive integer. Now, in terms of the foreign constraint, we could add an index to this. Or what we could also do is say, table, the foreign key called owner ID, well, what specifically does that refer to? Well, it's going to reference the ID column on the user's table. Nice and readable. So this will add the necessary constraint. It'll, of course, apply an index. We could even specify things like, well, on the condition that the user is deleted. Well, in that case, cascade down and delete all of the user's projects in the process. Some people like to add this. Some people just do it with PHP. I see benefits to both. So you have this option. And if you want to learn more, of course, refer to the Laravel documentation. Okay, so I'm going to say PHP Artisan migrate, and I'm going to do fresh. So remember, that basically drops all of the tables and reruns them from scratch. You, of course, never, ever, ever run this in production. And in fact, if you are in a production environment, Laravel is going to warn you and say, hey, are you really sure you want to do this? Because this is a destructive action. You only want to do this during development. Okay, so now if we give it a refresh, of course, we have no more projects because we stripped everything. So if we come back, here's our projects table. It's blank, but we do now have an owner ID column, and you'll see that we do have the necessary indexes. Okay, next, let's go back to our projects controller. So when we try to create a new project, let's take a look at that. Project/create. Well, it lets us create a project even though we're not signed in. So we need to fix that. Okay, I'm going to begin by running make auth, which we reviewed 2 lessons ago. So if I switch back to Sublime, in my routes/web file, we now have those authentication routes. So let's take a look. Login. Yep, we have a login page and a register page. Okay, let's do John Doe and register. So it fails. Let's see. Column not found, unknown column name. That's because we switched it to username, but the auth command is still expecting name. All right, you can either switch it back, of course, within your create users table. We could switch that back. Or, of course, you could go to the necessary controller and modify it. So within auth, register controller, we reviewed this a couple episodes ago. We could update this as well as this. Okay, but I'm going to stick with this and then do, once again, a migrate fresh. Okay, now we can run it one more time. There we go. John Doe is now registered and he has an account. Next, let's go to projects/create again. And now we can add the necessary middleware to protect this page. You can only create a new project if you are signed in. Okay, we now know how to do that. So in my projects controller, I can either put it up here, or as we learned, you can put it in your routes file. It's entirely up to you. Now, if you did want to go the controller route, here's something to consider. If I were to say this middleware auth, like we learned in the last episode, well, we give it a refresh, and it does work because we are signed in. But if I were to open a private window, notice I cannot visit that project's page. So it is working. However, you need to make sure, do we want to apply the auth middleware to every single one of these actions? So for example, to view all projects, should you be signed in? Well, maybe yes, maybe no. In our case, I think the answer is yes. If I want to show a single project, do you need to be signed in? Maybe yes, maybe no. It depends upon how you're building this application. Do you need to be signed in to create one? Yes and yes. Do you need to be signed in to edit and update one? Yes and yes. And of course to delete. So in this case, it's okay. However, in some cases, you might want to say, apply this auth middleware only to the given actions. For example, store and update, things like that. Or you could even say, apply it to everything except. So this would be the opposite. Everything except show. So you do have some flexibility there, or once again, you can apply it here. Okay? So now we have protected ourselves. You cannot view a project or create a project without being signed in. So let's sign Joe in again. All right, now he can visit this page. But if I were to say this, let's see how it's going to work. It fails. And of course it did. We added this owner ID column, but we didn't reflect that in the code. Take a look. Here, we're going to hit the store method, right? You submit that form and you hit the store method. We validate the request, and then we just say project create, and then we give it the title and the description. But we did not tell it what owner ID column to use. So it does, in fact, fail. Now you could do this in two ways. You could just append to the array. So you could say the owner ID column is going to be the authenticated user's ID. You could do that. Anyways, let's give that a run. And yeah, it did, in fact, work. So if I were to switch back to projects, we do have a brand new project that we can review. And further, this project belongs to this user. Now, another way to do this, of course, is to append after. So you could say the owner ID is going to be whoever is signed in, and then update this. Now, there is another way using eloquent relationships, but we'll save that for a little bit later. So this is now working. But now I think we do have a problem. So let's go to that user dashboard where we can log out here. All right, well, let's register a second user. Okay, let's have Jane Doe create a new project. All right. So yes, you can see that Jane only sees her projects and John only sees his projects. However, if Jane tries to look at a project that she doesn't own, and in this case, food title belongs to John. Take a look at this. This project belongs to the owner with an ID of 1. So that means Jane can look at her projects, but also John's projects. So it sounds like it's not just enough to ensure that a user is signed in, because that means if you're signed in, you can review any person's project. No, instead, we need a form of authorization. we need to determine whether or not you are authorized to look at this specific project. We'll learn how to do that in the next episode.